so I'm going to talk about the cognitive traits that that we believe actually come before the addictive behavior. And why is this important? A couple reasons might be that this might give us great targets for early interventions when we see risky cognition, if one would call it that, or risk factor on a cognitive level. Maybe we can intervene before people actually fully develop an addictive problem. And so it's based, this idea of the cognitive piece isn't new, right? I mean, people have been doing this for decades. The idea of cognitive therapy for addiction really is to change one's thinking about things, or as AA would call it, kind of stinking thinking. But we kind of tend to sort of see it as part of the picture as opposed to a predisposing trait. And again, if we can see that, particularly in adolescents or young adults at the time of that they start their addictive behaviors, it represents, I think, a sort of an incredibly more targeted approach. And I should also highlight the other piece of this is that there's a lot of heterogeneity when it comes to cognition. So even though cognitive behavior therapy focuses on sort of the cognitive distortions that people have about their behavior, there are numerous sort of ways of parsing out cognition, and what might be a cognitive problem for Bill is not going to be the same in a very nuanced fashion for Susie, who has a similar addictive problem. So having said that, that's sort of the lead into all of this. These are my financial disclosures. The research grant from a pharmaceutical company is irrelevant to this talk, and I will be talking about some off-label ideas here. We know a lot about addiction, just to sort of set the stage, with rodents. And although rodents are a very rudimentary idea, right, of cognition, they do have at least some basic ability to kind of think through some problems. Now, this has sort of given us some initial ideas of what the cognitive processes are. And of course, the one distinction with humans is that I hope that we actually have a greater array of thought and a deeper array of thought process than rodents do. But on a very basic level, what we see in animal models as well as humans is a desire for any number of things. And then the question of how much control we have over the behavior, and this might be sort of has been kind of deemed as kind of top-down control. I want things, but all day long I have to tell myself, should I? And is this a healthy option for me to choose? And this is where the idea of addiction, essentially, if we think of it as being out of control, this continued behavior despite the consequences, a loss of control, and then a desire. Desire is one part, and how we process that in terms of how much we want it, how much we can do without it, which is all a cognitive process. And then this loss of control, or my need to keep engaging in something beyond just some simple joy or anxiety reduction, and then into adverse consequences. I mean, for folks who don't have addiction, I think one of the most bewildering things is, right, when we sort of say to somebody, look, you're dying of your addiction, you have all these health problems, and the person's like, yeah, but I still want to do it. And you can struggle as a clinician with, how do you think that way, right? How are you not processing these short-term, moderate-term, and long-term consequences? And I'll talk a bit about what that means. Also, I think what these core components, the reason I highlight them is that they've also told us, and based on the animal literature, one of the more intriguing things about addiction now is the thought that perhaps we should stage it over time like cancer. And there's a growing sort of interest in this possibility, meaning, does the behavior actually change over time, and the brain change because of the behavior? Meaning, some people may describe on a cognitive level their desire to use addiction early on in life. Well, I can't cope with things. And the previous speaker had mentioned this idea of resilience. This could be based in early life problems. But it might be, I can't cope. I just want whatever the immediate effect of a drug is. But that same person, after 10, 20, 30 years of using an addiction, most likely now has become much more what we'd call compulsive, meaning that it's not driven by this urge to avoid a bad situation. It's not based on urges. It is most likely more habitual, that we'd call it. And people will describe this as, I don't really have much of a desire or thought process, but over time now I just use heroin, etc., whatever the drug is, really just to get through the day and to sort of just feel normal at this point. And why that's important is in the animal literature, now it's growing in the human literature as well, we can actually start seeing a circuit change from this impulsive circuit to a compulsive circuit over time. And now what that means is a few things. We don't know on an individual human level, right? Is it after 2 years, after 20 years, etc.? And so that is still sort of a question. But if it's true that the illness actually can change over time, and that that's a more of a typical response of addiction, then even our cognitive behavior therapy that we often use might need to be tailored for where in the stage of illness somebody is. If I'm talking to somebody about how to control their cravings, but the person has been using heroin for 40 years, it's probably less relevant. And instead, a more habitual sort of understanding, this kind of compulsive, and meaning compulsive just that it's habit form, it might have some reduction of anxiety, knowing I need to do it, but it's almost out of conscious thought. It's, okay, every Friday I do X, or every Monday morning I get up and do Y. Then the therapy needs to be tailored differently. And so if you have a group of 10 people who all say have heroin addiction, it might be that they are at different stages of illness biologically and cognitively. Now we know psychologically, developmentally, those are also relevant, but they all factor into sort of our thought process. I highlight just a typical diagnosis, what we use to make diagnosis of addiction, right? This is just an example of alcohol use disorder. They're all the same: cocaine use disorder, amphetamine use disorder, etc. The reason I highlight this is that it all shows, basically, even though we think of them as behavioral, they're very cognitive too, right? Taking in larger amounts over a longer period of time. So why am I now telling myself I need more? An effort to cut down. Is that, again, sort of a cognitive aspect? I don't feel like I can. What is my quote unquote willpower on a cognitive level? And many of these have that same piece to it. And I highlight this because when we think about people with multiple drug problems, one of the things that may cut across these is very similar sort of underlying cognitive problems, and even with comorbidities. So if somebody has an alcohol use disorder and they really can't control this behavior, they seem unable to think of inhibitory kind of control over it. What must I do? This may be also why they have, say, problems with relationship issues, anger issues, suicidality, that these may all represent a difficulty with control. And so therefore, if one can attack that cognitively, when somebody comes in for treatment, it may help with addressing the problems with the other comorbid problems, thereby sort of discounting the idea that somebody needs specialized treatment for one and then specialized treatment for the second, etc. And why, and it may also explain why we see so much comorbidity, but also comorbidity of certain things. It's very common in most people with addiction that you see these other impulsive problems, for example, particularly in youth with these problems. And so what are the common core elements to that? Meaning, is alcohol use simply the branch of the tree, and the tree trunk is something much more basic cognitively that can be attacked, and then all the branches will sort of die on the vine, so to speak, at the same time. And I just highlight this. And I think it's important because we used to think of tolerance and withdrawal, very physiological symptoms, as being the sort of major aspect of addiction. And I think DSM-5 got it right when it changed in 2013 and put tolerance and withdrawal on par with all these other aspects, because these other aspects speak to resilience, coping, sort of one's psychosocial context, but all of those things are also can be parsed out on cognitive levels. If I can't cope, what am I telling myself, for example, that makes me believe I can't cope, when in fact I probably can. I just highlight this because it makes us see that in the past year, alcohol and drug dependence is about, probably 10% of the population when one is, cautiously sort of very diagnostically restrictive about it. But we also see beyond the disorders that people have problematic use of these substances. And those are also, from an early intervention perspective, very important. We see this on college campus with binge drinking. Well, it may not make it to the point of an alcohol use disorder, but a lot of the data now suggests that the same person who has a problem with binge drinking probably has similar, maybe not as distorted cognitive issues, and therefore might still be a candidate for some early interventions that are the same interventions, but simply sort of curtailed in terms of intensity or the frequency of the intervention. And the same with lifetime problems. And so, when you're talking almost 40% of the United States has a lifetime problem with alcohol or drugs, it does make one wonder, our brains are not set up to be have an alcohol problem in one part and a drug problem in another, but they are set up to make choices. And how we make choices in terms of reward and consequences seems as if this may be a more fruitful underlying understanding to sort of address what is really a massive amount of people in the United States. I've already mentioned a little bit about animal studies. Primates see this too, and we do know that primates, again, have a more rudimentary cognitive approach. They have very, sort of well-developed reward circuits, but in terms of inhibition, they don't think as far into the future as humans do. And so that is one of the reasons on a cognitive level that many people avoid addiction, right? If somebody is tempted to, they ask a 16-year-old, hey, do you want to use heroin? The person who really is thinking long-term consequences, well, there are consequences to if I try heroin, I don't get to go to college, I won't have the future I want, etc. So that forward thinking really works very well for inhibitory drive currently. The problem with that future thinking is that it may be already problematic in people who are vulnerable to addictions, and or early use may skew one's cognitive processes. We also see this if we actually expand, and later today I'm talking a little bit more about these behavioral addictions, but if we look to the behaviors in addition to substance use, why do these all seem similar even though they're not taking a substance into the brain? It's because the brain is processing behaviors in much the same way that it's processing drugs. I enjoy gambling, now it's out of control, and I'm not thinking about the consequences. I think I can pay it back easily, etc., right? And so the thought process behind gambling is looking very much like the thought process behind cocaine addiction or alcohol. And yet, we know that the brain is not being affected by an actual drug of abuse. And so it makes you realize that, again, the thought process and the chemical underpinnings of behaviors are probably very similar. And if you expand, the prevalence of these, now you're talking maybe half of the country has some problems with addictions writ large in terms of these other behaviors. And this is just getting us into all sorts of new areas in the addiction field to understand how do they differ or not differ. And I'll talk a bit about it in a minute when I talk about sort of the specific neurocognitive deficits, but some of those such as delayed discounting, meaning I need an immediate reward, even if it's not the best reward, versus, I'll take it over a moderate term reward, which is better logically, but it's longer term. So the immediacy of needing something trumps the logic of it. We see that in substance addictions, of course, but we also see it in all of these other behaviors, interestingly enough. So are they the same? Should they be considered the same? And I think this is sort of still an open area of debate. And what we're seeing, and I would highlight the second from the bottom, we're seeing this particularly with technology, where not only are we concerned about people having problems with technology and using it excessively, but also even how technology is cognitively changing younger generations, right? So everything is an immediate reward. Well, then how will this actually dovetail with substance abuse as well as these other behaviors down the road? If you're basically priming the brain for constant reward without any real ability to inhibit a behavior, right? Everything is clickety-click very fast. Then when I want to feel a certain way or I want to get a rush from something, why won't I use just the quickest drug of abuse or, or medication or whatever to get that way? And we know that with the short acting anythings that give us a rush fast, they tend to be more addictive. So the worry may be that our technology will indirectly drive rates of substance addiction as well as other behavioral addictions. We also see that substance use, and this is not news to probably anybody, but I just want to put this in the context of cognition, because we see the highest rates for substance abuse really in formative years, right? Puberty, post-puberty, and into young adulthood is where we tend to see this. Now, one could argue that this is due to a lot of variables, right? Which of course it is. Home environment, family stress, family modeling, genetics, developmental issues. But all of that, one could also argue, factors into our brain development, and part of that brain development as an organ that tries to think through problems means that all of that is driving a cognitive process as well. And so what is the cognitive or our cognitive processes during this time period that makes the addiction particularly a vulnerability? And as you see, rates are quite low after the age of 25. They exist, but they're low. And after the age of 30, they're even lower. And to find somebody who really develops an addiction after the age of 50 is quite an oddity. They do occur, and we all know that, but in the big epidemiological picture, they are a rare bird. They may be people who actually come for treatment more, because quite frankly, I mean, let's be honest, you're not getting a lot of 17, 18-year-olds who voluntarily want to seek help. So clinical settings actually may not be even aware of this because it skews kind of older, right? I mean, the 40-year-old who's had a problem with drugs and alcohol is the one who comes in for treatment, not usually the 18-year-old. Having said that, that 40-year-old in most cases started having the problem early on and is now coming in for treatment because it's out of control, most likely. But so what is cognitively going on becomes really important, because the brain is not fully formed until the mid-20s. And so the brain is kind of uniquely situated during those early years to not only be more impulsive, as we all know, but also the cognitive processes of thinking about consequences and risk factors, et cetera, are not there, which is also why, even though alcohol dependence may peak at 21 and the young person is having problems, they're not coming in for treatment even until 31, because they're not even processing what they're experiencing in the correct way, right? That they're sort of thinking they can do it on their own, that it's not really much of a problem. And so all of those distortions sort of factor into it, this age group as having a problem. And that's most likely due to simply the brain development. I just sort of say that I'm not saying that these cognitive processes cause the addiction, but one can look at it more as contributing factors. In fact, we don't know what causes addiction. It's probably very multifactorial, right? Maybe this kind of idea of an addictive personality, I might have people rephrase that we're probably looking at risk factors for addictions, personality risk factors / cognitive. That could be risk-taking, sensation-seeking, etc. But in terms of a type of personality that's completely an addictive personality, there's really no evidence for that. It's more for the vulnerability factors. And so I just toss out that the cognitive piece might be a particularly ripe area for the picking in terms of understanding addiction and tailoring treatment. We do know that there might be metabolic factors and genetic factors, but even in those cases, such as in the case of people of Asian and East Asian or Southeast Asian descent who might genetically be predisposed not to metabolize alcohol well, so then they don't become addicted. That the thought process, though, might still channel them into other problems, which is why we see very low rates in Asian countries of alcohol, but very high rates of gambling. And so, so even these metabolic factors that might actually be something that actually just shifts us toward a particular addictive form, as opposed to being a risk factor for or against addiction. So as I mentioned, developmentally, all of these influences are taking place, and the neurons are growing kind of at a clip. We know this, and so the brain is developing. And during that process, it does very well. Now, it could be interrupted for many issues, right? It could be interrupted for genetic reasons, early life trauma, poverty, nutritional issues, or it's just that the fact that genetically people sort of self-select for different types of cognitive personality traits. So risk takers, you know, tend to sort of maybe like other risk takers. And if that's, if one can kind of find genetic aspects of that, then a risk-taking child might result for that same genetic vulnerability. Having said all of that, what we know is, though, that if during this healthy development, young people are exposed to addictive substances, I would even argue as well behaviors, that they may change the trajectory of this brain development, which is why from a public health perspective, one could argue that you really wouldn't want first alcohol use until, say, mid-20s. Now we set it at 21, which is, you know, changed from 18, and which is kind of bizarre because it's not, maybe it's a little bit better, but the science would still say probably mid-20s. And an early drug use and experimentation during teen years probably shift all of this. The brain does develop back to front with the nucleus accumbens, which is our motivation and drive center, developing very early on, which is why kids want things, and they want generally rewarding things. They want food, they want love, they want all these great things. If they are presented with something that also sort of taps the reward centers of the brain, either calming, oh, alcohol makes me less anxious. Oh, cocaine and stimulants make me feel high and more energized, right? Then this may preferentially exacerbate the development of the nucleus accumbens before the prefrontal cortex is fully formed, that would allow the person to actually make good judgments. And that this basically takes until 24, 25 on average for people to really have a fully formed brain where the judgment center is also making choices based on long-term risk, short-term risk, emotional state, etc. The emotional piece factors into this, obviously, because all of these are interactive circuits, and if I feel stressed and unloved, then I may give into motivation and ignore judgment, which is also why when under stress, and I would argue we all do this to some degree, don't we? I mean, if it's a very stressful day, you may decide, oh, you know, I don't care about exercise. I'm not worried about next week or 2 weeks down the road. I just need to feel good today, so I'll have a few extra drinks tonight, or I'll eat unhealthy, etc. But the fact that in most cases, if we haven't had trauma and we haven't had huge life stressors developmentally, that we put that into sort of balance in, again, the next day, and we say, okay, look, there's been a lot of stress, but I need to exercise because I need to think long-term, blah, blah, blah. And so this allows us to sort of make better judgments. And you can sort of see, again, where on a very basic level, when a discussion of early life trauma, this may be preferentially out of balance, always giving into short-term reward because of the stress response. Even if the prefrontal cortex is really well developed, the person, it's not uncommon for people to say, you know, I know what a good choice is. I know that I shouldn't drink. I don't even really care about alcohol that much. I don't have that strong of cravings. I just don't care about anything. And so it, you know, it allows me not to care. And so, you know, this is where that even that cognitive process must take account of all of these elements. So even though I'm talking about impulsivity or inhibition, you know, keep in mind it's part of a very interconnected, complex array of emotions, past historical understanding of what made us feel good or not, our current emotional state, our interpersonal states, etc. And this is, not to sort of expand upon this forever, but this is where the role of trauma has become very important. And as we know, even in treatment facilities, more and more treatment facilities are focusing on possibly looking at trauma as a way to sort of understand a current problem with addiction. And I think it hasn't been completely worked out perfectly. Some people can have trauma and it doesn't seem to affect their addiction 10 years, 20 years down the road. It might not. And so one doesn't, again, want to even use this as an example of one size fits all. Although we do see that people with addiction are more likely to report these histories. It's not the majority of people with substance use problems. It tends to be more female substance users as opposed to male. And again, so there's a lot of nuanced differences even in what we know about this epidemiologically. So it's, again, not everybody with an addiction has trauma, et cetera, but, and not everybody with an addiction who has trauma may need to have it addressed in the same way. We do understand that, again, as I mentioned, comorbidity, there's a lot of ways of understanding comorbidity, even cognitively, but we do tend to see a lot of the same types of comorbidity, don't we? And some of those are, again, sort of the more impulsive. So people who have some type of even low-grade mania, bipolar disorder, ADHD, anger issues, personality disorders, often with an impulsive element, relationship elements, kind of the symptoms of a borderline personality disorder. And are they pre-existing illnesses? Perhaps. That the person has 4 or 5 unique illnesses? Maybe. Do they interact in some way? Has one given way to the other? Or in some sense, have they all been branches of a same tree? And then if so, and I think important, is what that tree is. It's common stress, common genetics, common trauma, common cognition, etc. And so that understanding what that tree trunk is might be very useful, and it may not be one, right? It may be a very complex interactive approach, as I've mentioned, where I'm genetically predisposed to be impulsive. Stress makes me more impulsive, so does my trauma history, but I can still address then my impulsive cognitive abilities or thought processes as a way to perhaps, again, address all the branches simultaneously. And this just shows, again, mood, anxiety, personality disorders are some of the more common. And it might be, again, that not all folks with addictions clearly are the same. And we see different sort of groupings of different personality types and different comorbid problems in a person, but it may give us clues as to some of the common cognitive underpinnings of the addiction. So if somebody has ADHD and a substance problem, well, so what types of problems do we see in ADHD? Delay, discounting is a problem, inhibition is a problem, planning for the future is a problem. And so which one or multitude of those might be useful from an addiction? And that leads us to ADHD, which we do see elevated rates of just use, but also in children with untreated ADHD, we see elevated rates of substance use disorders. And these are odds ratios, 2 to 3 times the population at large. And we also see 2 to almost 5 times more commonly in untreated ADHD kids, just more use of alcohol, more use of marijuana and tobacco. It may not rise to the level of an addiction, meaning out of control and meeting these diagnostic criteria that I mentioned, but it still may be worth addressing. And again, what's that common thread? If we treat the ADHD, we actually find that much of this gets better. Okay, so what does that tell us? It tells us that a lot of the use was being driven by, one could argue, oh, it's being driven by untreated ADHD. Or I would think more globally, it's being treated by some of the core elements of ADHD that were untreated. And again, just for lack of a better term, kind of maybe the impulsivity, the attentional problems, etc., may have been more the key than, say, the disorder itself. And we see this in gambling too, that the rates are almost up to 10 times among gambling addicted individuals or problem gamblers that we see in people without it. So we do see this confluence of a lot of impulsive problems. Why is suicide risk enormously high in cocaine using individuals? Much higher than in depression. And many times when we do a suicide assessments, again, very heterogeneous without a doubt, but sometimes we definitely see these elements of impulsivity in suicide attempts, that people are looking for a quick and easy answer. I feel horrible right now, ergo, taking my own life will fix it. Then you say, well, did you realize you'd be dead? And the person kind of looks at you blankly and think, huh? Oh, okay, yeah, that's right. I didn't think that. I just needed something immediate right at this moment. And given the highly impulsive personality types and cognitive underpinnings of cocaine, in combination with the huge change in mood that coming off cocaine can do, one can sort of see suicide as an incredible risk factor in these folks because of even that underlying impulsivity. And we see it in alcohol. I mean, we see, unfortunately, so many people that once they're intoxicated are making even poorer decisions, and then they become suicidal because, again, they look to it as a very easy fix. They sober up the next day, so alcohol's out of their system. You see them in the ER setting in the morning, and they're like, wow, I don't want to kill myself. I mean, what was I thinking? Well, again, it speaks to not necessarily that they have comorbid depression, but that, a different formulation of it. They could, of course, but a different formulation could be that they have really bad cognitive impulsivity, and the alcohol disinhibited any type of control they had over being impulsive, and they were even more impulsive, right? And so and why is that even important? Because instead of necessarily giving somebody an antidepressant for comorbid depression, if it's a fundamental cognitive problem, the cognitive therapy, when it's being used for alcohol, can also address the cognitive underpinnings of the suicide attempt, and not see it as something disconnected from it, but seeing it as very integrated cognitively with the substance addiction itself. And this is why, and this is kind of, again, just a general overview of our motivational circuits. They involve many variables in our brain, everything, and we do it in rapid fire, speed. So we're not always aware every time we make a decision how many variables, and I just list some here, that go into that. The idea, again, of cognitive therapy often is to have people think almost in terms of minutia, the details of what they're thinking every second, the complexity of what they're thinking, and to have that incredible awareness, which I think is a first step, then allowing us to see where the distortions are. This is just a lovely picture of the brain, which I love. In the top right-hand corner is the human brain looking sideways, and particularly that 10P section at the very tip, which is different from below it, which is a rodent brain, is something unique, and that's our most forward thinking process. It's also how we understand our idealized self, meaning so that I think, oh, I'm going to be a great father, I'm going to be a great citizen, and that's the part that's thinking that. That is most likely engaged with that thought process. It's also a part that is sadly also quite damaged by drugs of abuse, particularly in the case of methamphetamine. And then when we see people for treatment and we want them to think far into the future, how do you want your future to be? Do you see the consequences of this? It's not surprising that people then look at us and say, I can't think that way. And you kind of think, well, are you just in denial? Are you not trying to? Are you lazy? Or, whatever, all these kinds of things that the person may feel like they're being judged with this, but they're really trying to, I think in many cases, tell us their brain simply doesn't work. And therefore, if they can't, then that's where behavioral elements do, I think, need to be put in place to have the person be reminded of future things and consequences if they're incapable of thinking that way. But it would be unfair to have people constantly go through these exercises and fail them if in fact their brain is not working, which one can kind of get to these days at even doing neurocognitive testing on patients, might be particularly useful in repeat folks who have been in and out of treatment multiple times, to really see what one is really dealing with in terms of still having sort of healthy brain tissue and healthy brain circuits. We do know that all of this is sort of done through neurochemicals, which help our cognitive process. Glutamate is probably now one of the most talked about and intriguing chemicals, because I have here that it's been part of our reward-seeking behavior in combination with dopamine. But we also know now in the prefrontal cortex, in the front part of the brain, that glutamate plays a role in inhibition and ability to say no to things, which will also, I think, just new data coming out on that level. And I think we're going to see more and more of that over time. Then the thought is, what can we do to actually modulate that part of the brain or exercise it in a more robust fashion to actually help people who may not, or for whatever reason, are not as able to inhibit their behavior. I mentioned the dopamine picture because it's, for people in the substance field, it has not been, I don't think, talked about as much as it has in the behavioral addictions. Dopamine and things that increase dopamine have now for 20 years been talked about as having resulted in gambling problems, potentially, in genetically vulnerable people who have also probably engaged in it in the past. And so the data is still a little dicey. About 8 to 9% of people who took dopamine agonists, meaning that it increased their dopamine, largely for Parkinson's or restless legs, started developing gambling problems. And this became quite a big brouhaha 20 years ago. And we still see it to the point that now, to make the gambling diagnosis, one has to know if someone's taking these types of drugs, because if you stop the drug, the gambling problem goes away. But what was less talked about was people started doing a whole range of addictive problems: alcohol, cocaine use, sex, etc. So it wasn't limited just to the behaviors. And again, not the majority, a very small minority in fact. But again, usually people who seemed family loaded in a first degree relative with other addictions, and or in people who had themselves maybe in the past had a little bit of a problem with it, although that wasn't the case in everybody. And so we now know that this may be the case. And why does that matter? Because we also now see it with aripiprazole, which is Abilify, which is a dopamine agonist as well in part. We see it with ADHD drugs. So even though I said prior that treating the untreated ADHD with a stimulant, or behavioral therapy for that matter, may be helpful in by decreasing impulsivity and therefore preventing substance problems. If the person doesn't really have ADHD and you treat them with a stimulant, you can make them more impulsive and less able to consider consequences. And that may then lead to any number of other addictive problems. So that, and how do we know that we're getting it right? Because it's really hard. There's no blood test, of course, and it's based on report and parent report and school report. And we all know that there's always some question about how accurate all of those things are. So I just say that as a cautionary tale, that one needs to sort of assess that rather judiciously. We also know the opiate system has a role in also in these urges, and these slides are a bit detailed. You can see them on your own. But for example, one aspect would be if we have too much drive to do something, which can be glutamate and dopamine, as I mentioned, and then on the front end of our brain, in the prefrontal cortex, not enough top-down control, which is glutamate in a different system, dopamine in a different system as well, interestingly enough, and some serotonin, that this may be where cognitively then we give in and we say, okay, you know, I'm going to do it. You know, I really want to do it and I don't think there are any consequences. Or we don't do it if we balance the consequences and think about the forward thinking. And this, somewhere in this circuit, is most likely what goes wrong with many people with substance problems. It also gives us many targets to help. And that's why if we look past the expressed behavior, drink too much, use drugs too much, look a layer below, it's cognition. And this is the basis for cognitive therapy, the thought being that a thought drives a behavior. Even though people say, no, I don't think I think, I just do it. Well, that may be habitual, but at some point there was a thought that drove the behavior. It may be now so rapid, fast, and habitual that the person isn't really able to describe it. But we don't tend to do something unless driven by a thought of some sort. It would be great to ultimately get to brain abnormalities and etiology, or the cause, environmental and genetic. We're not there yet, particularly on an individual level by any means. But what we can do in the clinic setting is actually assess cognition that underlies the behavior, because some people, you know, again, there are many different cognitive processes that may be all giving rise to what we see as drinking too much. and it speaks to the heterogeneity of the behavior itself. And so when we treat it with one type of therapy, one type of medication, one type of this, that may be why only 30-ish% of people get better, say in the case of maybe alcohol from cognitive behavior therapy, or 40% long-term better. And we may improve it if we can look a layer below and tailor it. And there are many things, as I've highlighted. It could be planning deficits, meaning how do I plan for the future? How do I take account of full range of aspects of something to actually create a full detailed plan? It could be a problem with cognitive inflexibility, and I'm only listing 4 here. I mean, there are tons of ways of understanding cognition. These tend to be some of the 4 major ones that we see. Cognitive flexibility, meaning how well do I take account of new information, right? I mean, so if I drive down the road and I always drive home this certain way and over a bridge, and now tonight it says bridge out, don't come this way, I am cognitively flexible enough to say, okay, that's new information, I need to change course. But what we see in many people who struggle with addiction is that they're not that cognitively flexible, and they're more rigid, and that may be a different target for treatment. And so I think that all of these represent possibilities. It's been described as this kind of hypofrontal aspect. People have talked about this now for a couple decades in addiction. We can see it on brain scans. That's a normal, healthy brain looking to your right as you look at the screen with the prefrontal cortex over in the rightmost part, and that's healthy. This is somebody with a substance problem, and those white matter tracts are simply not as robust, which means you don't get communication between parts of the brain. This is a study out of Cambridge, which I think everybody should know. It was in Science, and this woman looked at people with substance problems, their siblings, and then healthy controls. And she looked at a task of inhibitory control. How well do I say no to something after I start? It's kind of the potato chip test. How much am I able to stop after 2 potato chips? And what she found was the substance addicted siblings had all these deficits, and on brain scans, they were underactive in the ability to put on their brakes. Their siblings were almost identical. And the siblings had no drug problems, never had used drugs. So what does that tell us? It tells us that perhaps, one, there's a vulnerability, a cognitive vulnerability to addiction that even may run in families, and that those siblings would be well advised to maybe even get some training through psychotherapy on how to inhibit themselves and or how to channel it into healthier avenues, because they're at risk. And we would say, oh yeah, they're at risk because it's addictions run in the family. Now we know it's a little bit more nuanced. They're at risk because inhibitory control runs in these people's family. It may be some different cognitive underpinning in somebody else's family. And again, this is where we see this impulsivity or aspects of it across a wide range of problems that we would normally call comorbidity, but we now know might be a cognitive, again, the same cognitive process, the same tree trunk, different branches. And so we do know that it probably is an early symptom, and that one can probably predict who may go on, that adolescents who are very risk-taking and sensation-seeking by personality, but one can actually now look at this on cognitive testing and follow these people, which we've been doing, particularly in the case of gambling problems, and we see that it predicts the future development of, say, gambling addiction in those who have a range of sort of impulsive cognitive measures. This is just one example. And so what can we do with this? We do know that cognitive behavior therapy works, and I just have a couple minutes. We also know that there are medications that are used for the treatment of addiction. And again, why do they not work in everybody? Maybe they need to work in certain people, and we need to sort of better tailor it. A whole range of psychosocial treatments that could be better tailored depending on the neurocognitive deficits that some people have. That if somebody cannot really imagine things, imaginal exposure exercises, which were used about 40 years ago with some very good benefit around the world, less so in America, might be useful for people, etc. And this is just showing CBT and where the goal of CBT, and we've known this, but now we have a better biological understanding of probably how CBT is truly working, and also how to fine tune it for people if we knew more about the specific cognitive deficits that they have. And so I think that subtyping people clinically might be useful. Neurocognition is just one aspect. Comorbidity, genetics, imaging can all be used, but not as genetics and imaging not ready yet for prime time. And this is where we may find high impulsives, low compulsives, low impulsives, etc. And this is just a very scant schematic of something or something like this that may be more useful to really sort of see the heterogeneity in the folks that are coming in for treatment. So that's my email. If people have questions, they can also email me. Happy to field that. Or if people want the actual articles, I can send you references for anything that was talked about today. Thank you.